Putin News Now. Russian mercenary leader's plane lands in Belarus, according to flight tracking website. According to a flight tracking website, Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane touched down in Belarus on Tuesday. Prigozhin is the Russian mercenary leader who led an armed revolt against President Vladimir Putin's government on Saturday. Whether or not Prigozhin was on board the flight was initially unknown. The Associated Press also reported that a criminal investigation into the armed rebellion had been closed by Russian authorities without any charges being brought against Prigozhin or the other participants. Since he allegedly made a deal with Putin's government allowing him to travel to Belarus in exchange for stopping rebel forces marching on Moscow, the whereabouts of the head of Wagner Group have been unknown. An Embraer Legacy 600 jet with the tail number RA-02795 took off from St. Petersburg around 1 a.m. local time on Monday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and eventually landed in southern Russia, as shown by the flight tracking website FlightRadar24. The plane took off from an unnamed Russian airport on Tuesday morning and landed in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Prigozhin, also known as Putin's chef, purchased this plane from a Seychelles-based company in 2018 under its previous name, M-San, according to 2019 U.S. Treasury sanctions documents. Autolex is being investigated by the FBI for materially assisting Prigozhin, a crime punishable by imprisonment in the United States. According to a press release issued by the Treasury Department at the time, anyone who grants landing rights or other services to the plane runs the risk of facilitating or supporting Prigozhin's nefarious activities and may also be subject to future sanctions. President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus said on Tuesday that his country's armed forces were in full combat readiness as a result of the Wagner rebellion. "My position is, if Russia collapses, we will remain under the rubble, we will all die," Lukashenko, Putin's closest ally in Europe who claimed to have helped broker the deal that ended the armed mutiny, told journalists in Minsk. The state-owned RIA news agency reported that a criminal case against Prigozhin was closed because the participants had ceased actions directly aimed at committing the crime, contradicting earlier reports that the case was still open. After calling off what he later termed a «march of justice», as his fighters headed toward Moscow, the Russian capital, on Saturday, Prigozhin's immediate future has been the subject of much speculation. Taking Rostov-on-Don, a major city, and shaking Putin's authority, as well as sowing doubt among millions of Russians already weary from the 15-month war in Ukraine, were accomplished before the rebels withdrew. Putin slammed the rebels as traitors in a televised address on Monday, accusing them of helping those who want to see the country drowned in a bloody domestic strife. Prigozhin stated that he took action to save Wagner from being destroyed by the Russian Defense Ministry, and not to overthrow Putin's regime. He used Russian slang for destroyed, when he said, experienced fighters, experienced commanders will be simply smeared, and will basically be used as meat, adding, "We did not have the goal of toppling the existing regime and legitimately elected government." Prigozhin also restated claims that the deaths of nearly 30 mercenaries in Ukraine at the hands of Russian military fire on a Wagner unit served as a trigger for the uprising. Moneytips.com. While Russian President Vladimir Putin tries to regain control of a tense situation, Chinese Premier Li Qiang assures his country's economic growth will rebound in the second quarter. Bankrupt Lordstown prompts a meeting of the world's top central bankers in Portugal. China will grow faster than expected in 2023. Premier Li Qiang predicted Tuesday that China's economic growth would be higher in the second quarter than the first, and that the country would achieve its annual economic growth target of around 5% with the help of additional stimulus measures. At the World Economic Forum in Tianjin on Tuesday, Li said, "We will launch more practical and effective measures in expanding the potential of domestic demand, activating market vitality, promoting coordinated development, and promoting high-level opening to the outside world." Foreign investors' worries about the slowing growth of the world's second-largest economy, China, despite the repeal of its COVID policies, will be alleviated by this news. China's gross domestic product grew by 4.5% year-on-year in the first quarter, but has since lost steam, leading many major banks to reduce their growth forecasts. On Monday, S&P Global became the first major global credit ratings agency to reduce its forecast for China's economic growth this year, from 5.5% to 5.2% for 2023. Putin is trying to take power back, too. In an effort to reassert his authority, Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed in a televised address on Monday that he had purposefully allowed the mutiny by the Wagner group of mercenaries to last as long as it had in order to keep the violence to a minimum. Putin said, "From the very beginning of the events, steps were taken on my direct instruction to avoid serious bloodshed. Those Wagner soldiers who did not want to serve in the Russian army were given the option to either relocate to Belarus or return home, as stated by the Russian leader." But he said nothing about the fate of the organization's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and it's hard to imagine how he can afford to leave such a threat to his position unchecked. Gains in futures trading amid a week of crucial economic data. As investors awaited the next batch of economic data for clues on the health of the U.S. economy ahead of the Federal Reserve meeting in July, U.S. futures inched higher on Tuesday, bouncing back from recent losses. The Dow futures contract was up 20 points, or 0.1%, at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, 9 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, while the S&P 500 futures contract was up 8 points, or 0.2%, and the Nasdaq 100 futures contract was up 50 points, or 0.4%. The Nasdaq Composite, which is particularly sensitive to technological developments, fell by nearly 1.2% on Monday, the most of the three major equity averages. Despite these declines, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is expected to gain nearly 2.5%, the S&P 500 is projected to finish June up over 3%, and the Nasdaq is forecast to rise over 2%. Despite the Fed pausing rate hikes this month, the central bank has signaled that it may still raise rates this year if the economic outlook warrants it. The latest numbers on new home sales, building permits, and durable goods orders will be released on Tuesday before the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, is released on Friday. Walgreens Boots Alliance, Nasdaq, WBA, a drugstore chain, and Jefferies Financial Group, NYSE, Jeff, a financial services firm, are two companies that will soon be reporting earnings. 4. Lordstown declares bankruptcy and sues Foxconn. Prior to announcing legal action against Taiwanese company Foxconn, TW, 2354, U.S. electric truck manufacturer Lordstown Motors, Nasdaq, RIDE, filed for bankruptcy protection on Tuesday. The lawsuit alleges that Foxconn failed to invest up to $170 million. Due to the high cost of R&D and production, Lordstown intended to form a partnership with the world's largest electronics contract manufacturer, Foxconn, to have the vehicles produced for sale by Lordstown. As part of the agreement, Foxconn invested more than $50 million in Lordstown and now owns about 8.4% of the city. Lordstown, an electric vehicle manufacturer, claims Foxconn has failed to make additional investments as promised, leaving it short of cash and making it difficult to increase production of its endurance trucks. The electric vehicle manufacturer reported in a May regulatory filing that the material costs were substantially higher than our selling price for the few trucks it had assembled in recent months. Central European Bank, ECB, officials meet in Portugal 5. In what amounts to the European Union's version of the annual Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, President Christine Lagarde, her European Central Bank colleagues, and the rest of the world's central banking elite are gathered this week in the Portuguese hillside resort of Sintra. This week should provide fresh data on the persistent nature of prices on both sides of the Atlantic, making inflation the topic du jour. The European Central Bank, ECB, is expected to raise interest rates again in July, bringing the total increase in borrowing costs since last year's Sintra meeting to 400 basis points. Geeta Gopinath, the IMF's deputy managing director, said in her opening remarks at the conference on Monday that further increases may be necessary. "We're not seeing inflation return to target fast enough," she complained. To paraphrase, this means that central banks, including the ECB, must remain committed to fighting inflation despite risks of weaker economic growth. That inflation in the euro area is too high and is set to remain so for too long, as Lagarde put it earlier Tuesday, is a consensus among experts.